Thanks for joining us. This is Nick here with Pictureline, your premier camera store. And we are super excited to have just learned about the Canon EOS R5 and R6, as well as a handful of new RF lenses, and are very pleased to have Rudy Winston and Eric Stoner here with us today from Canon. Just hoping to kind of touch base with you and hopefully get a few follow-up questions answered if you have a few minutes. How does that sound?
The pleasure's ours.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome.
Oh, fire when ready.
Hearing all of the specs from these new cameras, it sounds like this represents a pretty significant step forward for Canon. What can you tell us about some of the major steps that Canon has made from a development standpoint, generally speaking, with these two bodies?
Well, the big thing with the R5 and the R6 is that they represent just an incredible fusion of design, excellence, and performance. And that performance centers on two primary things. One is hardware speed. The imaging sensors, we'll talk about these in detail, but the imaging sensors are new and they are much faster at scanning the surface of the sensor for information from a still or video frame and quickly flushing the sensor and being ready for the next picture. Much faster sensor operation than we have ever had before in a mirrorless camera. And then the main thing is the processing. These cameras use the same Digic-X processor that we launched with the EOS 1DX Mark III earlier this year. We have never seen a mirrorless camera from Canon with this level of processing power. And that combination of hardware speed and processing power has really just ramped everything up. It isn't just frames a second. It's the autofocusing system. It's the responsiveness of all the camera's controls and so on. We have truly leaped forward a couple of generations in mirrorless with these two cameras compared to where Canon has been previously.
Yeah, the introduction of the Digic-X processor was certainly big news when the 1DX Mark III came out, and hearing that it's included in these mirrorless cameras is just phenomenal. Do you know, was that always kind of the plan with the Digic-X processor, or did it just sort of happen to work out that it was a perfect match for the goals that Canon had with these two cameras?
The engineers haven't really clearly articulated one way or the other, but it is very clear, reading the tea leaves, so to speak, that they knew that they had to really raise the bar with these cameras. And Canon historically has had a belief that processing in a digital camera is one of the keys, not just to speed, but to image quality excellence, performance, and so on. And we've seen that for many, many years in our cameras with the advances in Digic processors. And this clearly is the pinnacle of where we've been up to now anyway.
So obviously the R5 is using a new sensor in the Canon lineup. What can you tell me more about the sensor design as well as the sensor design for the R6?
Well, both of these cameras actually are using new sensors. And contrary to some internet speculation, because we had the luxury of having several development announcements from Canon over the winter and spring about the R5 camera to give us some preliminary information. But Canon never breathed a word in those about the R6, but still there were leaks and a lot of internet speculation about the R6. And much of that centered on, a lot of people thought, oh, well, it'll be using an older processor, maybe from a previous version of the 1DX. That's not true. The 20 million pixel sensor, in the R6 is essentially the same sensor that's in the 1DX Mark III. Once again, we just announced that camera earlier this year. So they're both new sensors. They both emphasize dual pixel CMOS autofocus, excellent performance in terms of low noise and image quality. And I mentioned before, underlying everything is that system speed. And then, of course, with the R5 camera, we've got a brand new 45 million pixel sensor with all those same attributes.
The R5 and the R6, if I understand correctly, are both capable of shooting up to 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. That is not, I'm not misunderstanding that, correct? They have the same speed?
No, you're absolutely correct. And this is an interesting thing about when we look at the two cameras is that there are some areas where the two cameras are very similar, if not identical. And then there are clearly other areas that we'll get into where they definitely go their own separate way. Now, one obvious one is 20 million pixels versus 45 million pixels. But you are absolutely correct. The shooting speed on both cameras is identical. 12 frames a second max with the mechanical shutter or first curtain electronic, and then up to 20 frames a second with servo autofocus. And we'll talk about that autofocus because it is the most powerful autofocus we've ever put in a camera. Up to 20 frames a second with servo autofocus using the electronic shutter. That's the case with both. The one place they're going to differ, which you would expect with the file sizes, is in terms of their burst rates. How many shots in a row can you continually take before the camera has to kind of call time?
You read my mind. That was going to be my next question.
Reading your mind. If you're using the CF Express card, and we'll talk about cards in a bit, but if you're using the CF Express card in the R5 camera, you can shoot up to 180 raw images in a continuous burst at up to 20 frames a second before it has to call time. In the case of the R6 camera with 20 million pixels, that can go up to 240 raw images in a row before, again, it has to call time.
I imagine that that the file sizes involved with that 45 megapixel sensor really kind of helps to dictate what type of memory solution you would be using in that camera. Is that kind of the case with the CF Express?
Absolutely. And we had to, it's a no-brainer that with cameras aimed at this type of clientele, we had to have two memory cards. In the case of the R5, we had to go CF Express in one of those card slots so that you would have a substantial raw image burst rate when you're shooting stills, especially at these speeds. But then on top of that, and we'll get into this shortly, I'm sure, for the 8K video capability and the 4K capabilities, we needed a really fast card solution as well. So one CF Express slot, he tried to say, on the R5 camera, and one SD card slot, UHS-2. And then on the R6, two UHS-2 compliant SD card slots.
So you touched on it a little bit earlier, but the autofocus system on these cameras seems like it is revolutionary for any manufacturer, Canon no exception. What can you tell me specifically about the new eye, face, and head detection autofocus systems that these cameras are utilizing?
Once again, at the core of it is processing. And the level of processing in this camera is just, or these cameras, because they're using the same processor. And the autofocusing system, let me just parenthetically say this. The autofocus system in the R6 and the R5 is identical. It's not like you're going to get faster performance out of one, or one has some extra custom functions or anything like that. They are identical in terms of their performance, with one minor exception that I'll get to in a minute. In terms of the subject detection capability, these cameras just really raise the bar in terms of their ability to deal with people, because you have face detection, of course. You have eye detection, but at a far greater level of performance than we had in the previous generation EOS R series. And then on top of that, we bring into this camera the same head detection technology that we introduced for live view with the EOS 1DX Mark III. That head detection is important. What it means is that the camera can continue to keep focus on a person's head if they turn away, if the person is wearing headgear, a helmet of some kind or some kind of face mask, if they have a hat with a visor that is covering the eyes, so the system can't recognize two eyes, a nose, and a mouth for ordinary face detection. It won't just all of a sudden now start looking at the chest or looking at something in the background that has detail because it says, whoops, I don't see a person anymore. The head detection is actually a very important thing. And then
so really helpful for sports, I would imagine.
Exactly.
Okay.
And all this works with the camera shooting at high speeds in servo autofocus. And then on top of that, we have animal detection for the first time at Canon. And they have really taken this and run with it. because we not only have animal eye detection for cats, dogs, and birds, we have face detection, so that if the subject can't be recognized, eyes can't be recognized, like a shaggy dog that may have fur covering up their eyes or whatever, the system can detect animal faces, and body detection. So even if it can't clearly see a face, or if an animal is moving away from you, it can still detect a body and keep focus on it. And we really think that wildlife photographers, birds in flight type photographers, and so many others are going to truly embrace this capability. This trifecta of animal detection capabilities, face detection, eye detection, and body detection, is something that right now no other full frame mirrorless system on the market can offer. And we have, jumped from not having animal detection at all to moving to the top of the pack.
Now, you alluded a little bit earlier to there was one minor difference between the autofocus systems. What can you tell me about that?
Right. It's the low light sensitivity threshold. In the case of the R6 camera, it's a half a stop greater. If you think about it, if you just remember back with the EOS R, one of the great features of the EOS R camera was its low light autofocusing capability, where we could get down to EV -6, which is, an extremely low light level.
Yeah, really low light.
With an f1.2 lens. We can match that with the R5 camera with the 45 million pixels. With the R6, which has larger pixels because of 20 million, not 45 million, we can actually improve the sensitivity slightly. So it's down to EV -6.5, 6.5. That is the only difference between the two focusing systems.
So obviously we've seen, the photos of the new cameras. They're very similar physically. How are they in terms of construction? Are they the same construction? Are they slightly different? Things like weather sealing and shutter life, those types of things. How do they compare in that way?
There are two aspects of this I want to explore real quickly, but to directly answer your question, they are different. Both weather sealed and durable. Think about the R6 as being similar to a camera like the EOS R or the EOS 6D Mark II in terms of a polycarbonate exterior, good weather sealing. In this case, shutter durability that exceeds either one. Canon engineers are saying on the R6 camera, the shutter's been durability tested to 300,000 exposures. Now, just to put that in perspective, when we launched the 5D Mark IV camera back in 2016, engineers at Canon said that shutter, which has certainly proven itself to have a pretty good track record over the years, they said that shutter had been durability tested to 150,000 exposures. So we've doubled that with the R6. Now, when we look at the R5, now we're talking a magnesium alloy shell on the camera. The exterior is all magnesium alloy. There is more metal content in the camera, and even more extensive weather sealing, gasketing, and so on. And then finally, the shutter on that camera, durability tested to 500,000 exposures. Up to now, Canon has had one interchangeable lens camera ever that the engineers have said is durability tested to 500,000 exposures, and that is the EOS 1DX Mark III that we, again, introduced earlier this year. So this camera's in some pretty heady company. We're not saying that in terms of weather resistance, build quality, it's a 1DX Mark III, but it's the next thing. It's the next thing to it. The other thing, real quickly, I wanted to just mention when we're talking about the design and so on, is the handling on these cameras and the control layout. Anyone who is familiar with working with traditional digital SLR cameras and so on is going to find the experience of working with either of these cameras to be simply remarkable. They are so responsive. The controls, you have a proper quick control dial on the back of the camera for instant access to your exposure compensation, aperture control if you're in manual. You have a top dial that protrudes out from the back for direct ISO adjustments, which we didn't have on the EOS R. And then finally, we have a proper 8-way multi-controller for moving your focusing points. And anybody who comes to look at this camera, you have to play with that 8-way multi-controller. It is so responsive. It is so quick to move your points in a controlled manner from side to side, up and down, and so on. You know, you couple that with the touchscreen interface that we've been so good at over the years and so on. These cameras are simply a joy. To anybody who knows their cameras, these are simply a joy to handle and work with.
Yeah, I noticed that the layout on the cameras seems to be a little bit more familiar than what we're used to with the R and the RP. Is that based heavily on user feedback, or how did they make that that decision from a design standpoint?
I haven't articulated all the factors that went into it, but I think that, you know, among other things, there's always been a recognition at Canon that for years, EOS has represented design excellence and handling excellence. You know, thinking back over the years, the EOS 1 series, the 5D series, the 7D series. Great ergonomic design is nothing new to Canon. And now I'm putting words in their mouth. They never said this, but it seems like the designers were kind of let out of the room and told, hey, you know, get this right. And believe me, these cameras handle like an EOS.
So it's going to be a camera that's going to be easy to pick up and just start using, particularly if you're already familiar with Canon cameras.
Right, but you know, one of the cool things is that these cameras are so powerful and pack so much of a punch for photographers and videographers. We think a big market for these cameras is going to be people who are using competitive cameras right now. So even people familiar with other brands, I think you're going to find the design on these extremely intuitive and easy to work with.
So tell me, you know, you mentioned video. Tell me a little bit more about the 8K video. Do R5 users that are planning on using this, are they going to need to have like an external recorder to be able to utilize that feature? Is it a firmware update that they need to wait for, or is it ready to go out of the box? What do we need to know about that?
First off, it is absolutely ready to go right out of the box. Just for a second, if I can deviate, one of the major innovations that both the R6 and the R5 bring, even though the R6, of course, does not shoot 8K video, one of the major innovations they bring is that with either camera, you can record internally to the memory card 10-bit 422 video files in any of the resolutions that the cameras support. We do not require you to go to an external recorder via HDMI out to be able to get 10-bit 422 recording, which most of our competitors do at the present time. To answer your questions, though, the 8K capability, which is unique to the R5, that is good to go recording to the CF Express card. You can't do that to the SD card, rather.
Okay.
And again, that can be 10-bit 422. That can be, let me take that back, because if you shoot 8K RAW, it's 12-bit. But you have the option of doing either all-I compression or IPB compression with your 8K. That has the ability to do either 8-bit or 10-bit 422, either way. 8K recording can be at 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second. And okay, you know, we understand 8K is not going to be for every video user. We get that. But for those who want to take advantage of it, it is there now. You are not going to have to wait for a firmware upgrade. You're not going to have to get some special external recorder or whatever. Just put a CF Express card in the R5 camera, and you're good to go. The 4K capability on both cameras is very extensive. Now, video in general is one area where the two cameras kind of go their separate ways in terms of all the features, 8K, of course, being one. In 4K, you have the ability with the R5 camera to record 24, 30, or 60 frames a second. And then you have a high frame rate option in 4K on the R5 of 120 frames a second. And of course, both cameras support full HD as well. The full HD is up to 60 frames a second. The R6 camera, I think a lot of people are kind of maybe, I'm not saying you, but I think a lot of people are maybe losing a little sight of the power of the R6 camera, because while it doesn't have 8K, you've got pretty potent 4K capability in that camera, up to 60 frames a second, including 24 frames a second. And at full HD, you've got the ability to go up to 60 frames a second. And once again, you've got a high frame rate setting of 120 frames a second. Let me add one other thing. in terms of the 4K on both cameras, and that is with the R6, 4K is always oversampled from a 5.1K original capture down to 4K,
Oh, wow.
which should mean even better 4K video quality. In the case of the R5 camera, the 45 million pixel version, there is a separate line item that's called high quality video or HQ video. When you have it set for 4K, if you choose that, you are telling the system to again do this from an 8K original and sample that down to 4K. So you've got that level of oversampling. The one thing to just be clear on with the R5 is that doesn't just happen anytime you set 4K. You've got to engage that high HQ video capability in the menu, but it's right there sitting in front of you in the menu.
Okay. So what do the file sizes look like on the 8K for people that are planning to utilize that? If you put a 256 gig CF Express card in, for instance, how much time is that going to allow it to record?
There's no getting around
that. Imagine they're pretty big files, right?
Yeah, these are going to be big files. No getting around that. With a 256 gig card, raw 8K video, and raw can only be done in 8K. There is no 4K raw on the R5 camera. That would give you about 13 minutes of recording to fill a 256 gig card. If you go to the all-I compressed video, it's still a very stout file. Now you would get on a 256 gig card, you'd get about 26 minutes of recording. And if you're willing to go with the IPB compression, which is a stronger level of compression, now you can get up to an hour and 12-minute recording on that same 256 gig card at 8K.
I mean, that's fairly impressive given the the resolution that we're dealing with here. I mean, obviously, CF Express sales will be going up for videographers that are looking to utilize that feature, but definitely good to know. How I know that a lot of manufacturers that have kind of dabbled in the high resolution video have struggled with heat issues. Particularly when recording at the the highest quality levels. How did Canon address that with the R5 specifically in the 8K video, the heat that's generated from the sensor and the processor?
I mentioned before that the level of processing power in these cameras is off the charts compared to where Canon has been up to now. And it's really at the heart of why these cameras are so special. Anywhere you look, autofocus, still image shooting, certainly video performance as well. But you're right, with this level of processing, one of the byproducts is going to be internal heat. And you can't have it both ways. You can't have a nice compact design that is weather sealed and gasketed and so on, and then at the same time have it vent heat out in an extremely efficient manner. So the engineers have clearly done what they can to have the chassis in the camera absorb heat and to leave some amount of space between the processor and other components to allow some heat dissipation. But all that said, we are telling customers that if you're recording 8K, expect that if you start with the camera at true room temperature, about 73 degrees, give or take internally, that you can record for about 20 minutes. And at that point, there is a built-in sensor, and when it senses that there is sufficient heat buildup in the camera, it's going to warn you, but then it's going to shut the camera down. So we get it that this is probably not going to be the hot setup for recording long press conferences at 8K, unmanned, because again, it's, you've got about a 20-minute time limit, regardless of the size of the memory card. This is an issue of just the system has internal heat sensing, and it knows when it's had enough, and it is going to need a period to cool down after that. The same can happen in 4K at 60 frames a second and 120 frames a second, although you can record for longer at 60p in 4K than in the 8K, where I mentioned the tops is going to be about 20 minutes. For short bursts, for people that are doing, B-roll stock type video footage, but want that future-proofed, extremely high quality, high resolution video to have in their files, this is going to be great. It's only the person that wants to sit there and do long form recording where you're just going to have to be cognizant of that. There is about a 20-minute time limit.
Okay. Now, with previous generation cameras, we've seen like a hard stop at 29 minutes and 59 seconds. Is that no longer the case with the R5 and the R6?
No, you still have that. You still have that. So that even at full HD 24 frames a second, where heat is not generally an issue at all, a single file is going to have to stop at 29:59. The cool thing there, of course, like with previous generation Canon cameras, is that if you're at the camera, all you got to do is just hit the start button again, and it'll start recording again. You can't do that. Build up.
So besides the 8K feature, are there any, I mean, you touched a little bit on some of the frame rate option differences between the R5 and the R6. Anything else that you feel is super relevant that we should address here?
Couple of cool things kind of at random. One is that both cameras take the same battery grip, and both cameras are going to ship with a new battery. It's a new version of the very popular LPE6 battery that we've been using in our mid-range and upper-end cameras, 7Ds, 6Ds, 5Ds for a long time now. This is called the LPE6NH. It's about 14% higher capacity. And these two cameras, because of their processing power, are going to need that, but they are compatible with older LPE6 batteries that a customer may have in their bag right now. You're just obviously not going to get quite the battery life out of the older ones that you would here. The new battery is likewise backward compatible. So you can take the new battery, which is easily identifiable, incidentally, because on the top of the battery, in addition to the embossed Canon logo, there is a kind of shimmering trustgram logo. It's on there, partly as an anti-counterfeiting measure, but also it makes it very easy to identify the new battery compared to the older LPE6s you may have in your bag. Anyway, the new battery is backward compatible to the EOS 60D. So pretty much any older EOS camera that accepted the LPE6s can continue to use these new ones. So that's a nice solution. Again, new battery grip is going to be compatible with both cameras, the R5 and the R6. It'll take one or two of the LPE6 batteries, any flavor.
I guess my last question is, who would you say is the target customer for the R5 and the R6? I mean, obviously there will be, crossover for both models, but who would you really say is the intended audience for each of these models?
I want to start with the R6 because I think there is a real possibility, not only because its price point is going to be lower, but because of its combination of performance and, in particular, its high ISO performance. The lack of noise at high ISOs. I'm not saying there's none, but you have very good high ISO noise performance on this camera. We really think that this is going to check off a lot of boxes for many, many different types of photographers. And for folks who, just say, look, I'm not making big prints. I don't necessarily need 45 million pixels of resolution. I can deal with somewhat smaller sizes, especially if most of the work is going to be shown on screen, whether it's, on, their website or whatever it might be. The 20 million pixels is more than enough. And we really think, in particular, I want to throw this out for consideration. In a lot of ways, the R6 is an almost perfect wedding camera for the professional wedding photographer. It is just a combination of virtues, including the ability to shoot silently, a great autofocusing system that can deal marvelously with people, its responsiveness in your hands, the high ISO performance, and so on. This is really, we think, going to be a strong performer there. And then for those photographers who say, look, I love all those virtues, but I just feel more comfortable with more pixel resolution. Well, we got the R5 with 45 million pixels. That camera, look at the possibilities there in terms of the customer, nature, landscape, that kind of thing is going to fall, right into that. Folks that are dealing with, high-end macro photography where detail is extremely important. Architecture, because these cameras work beautifully with any of the Canon tilt shift lenses with the lens mount adapter. Architecture is a field where with 45 million pixels, it's going to be, just a natural fit. People that are doing, extremely high-end portrait photography, that kind of thing, where you want the detail, and you don't think 20 million pixels is going to be quite enough, and believe me, 20 million pixels is going to be enough for a lot of things. But if you feel like you just need more, the R5 is your answer. And, one of the things, just to clear this up, we have experience with high resolution full frame cameras going back to the EOS 5DS and 5DSR from 2015 that have been in our lineup ever since. 50 million pixel cameras. The level of noise, the color reproduction, and the level of final detail that you get with an imaging system that is 5 years newer is off the charts. I mean, this is just, it is a totally different experience than working with the R5, the 5DS or 5DSR cameras, which were great in their day, and it still are making money for a lot of photographers. But these, we think, are really going to light people up when they think about the possibilities for large images.
Awesome. Well, I am definitely in a very large group of people that is very excited to get my hands on these new cameras, put them through the paces, and see if it can help my photography game a little bit from where it is currently. Thank you so much, Rudy, for all of the information and for answering our questions today. We look forward to seeing the success that these cameras have, and I'm sure that there's more great things on the horizon for Canon as well.
Nick, it's a pleasure to be with you, to be able to speak to your Pictureline customers. Pleasure to be here, and it's our opportunity to be able to just tell this story. So we thank you for this opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks again. Have a great day.
You too.